project is called Aristotelian Autonomy, which I realize does have a somewhat paradoxical, if not perverse air to it. But the idea is just this, to think about the fact of what the ideal of autonomy is and what it could be from within a virtue ethical kind of perspective. So obviously it can't be, right, what Kant thinks about as autonomy, it's sort of an act of a will at a discrete time. You're either totally autonomous or not, right? But I do think there's a certain kind of ideal of personal autonomy. Joseph Raz talks about it as being part co-author of your own life, right? That is very valuable and is something we don't necessarily want to give up. Even if it sort of is paradigmatically modern, maybe we can give some different account of it. So that's what I've been thinking about for a year or so or longer. What it means to have a life that's authentically your own, to have a character that's authentically your own, right? But that's all a bit up in theory land, some of the different definitions of autonomy and authenticity that I talk about in the first part of the book. So what I decided to do for today that I thought would be of interest not only to philosophers but perhaps the psychologists in the room was talk about a kind of just particular moral problem that we could all sort of face that I think has to do with shaping our own character, shaping our own life, and say what I think a virtue theorist should say about that. So I'm going to talk about moral risk. Okay. And some of this is on the handout. Moral agents sometimes face what I shall call a situation of moral risk. This is on the handout. A situation in which an agent is capable of achieving some important non-moral good for others, but only by embarking on a course of action that poses a genuine risk to her character, and so poses a genuine risk to her leading an active life of virtue. Okay, so a non-moral good in this context is simply a good other than virtue or virtuous activity, as I use the term. So health, even though it's a necessary condition of acting virtuously, is still a non-moral good, the way I think about it. Similarly, while temperance and acting temperately are moral goods, food, drink, sex, all that kind of stuff are non-moral goods. Okay, they're genuine goods, just not moral goods as I'm using the term today. This is so even though one can only act temperately if these latter goods are present. Okay, so here's an example of moral risk. This is adapted from a case by Tom Herka, who I thought might be here actually today, but I think his flight was delayed, so that's too bad. Okay, I've given this a name, Nora, but the case is from him. So, okay, Nora, she's thinking of going into nursing because she sincerely wishes to relieve the pain and suffering of others. Okay, and were she to go into nursing, she almost certainly would relieve much pain and suffering. Okay, but she also rightly fears that the exposure to pain might make her a less compassionate and thus less virtuous person. She might even get to the point, so Herka says, where she does the job only for the money. I guess that's true empirically, that there are a lot of people in the medical profession who just find it very stressful and only do it for the money at the end of the day, even if that's not how they started out. So I'm told. Okay, if that were to happen, her ability to live an active life of virtue in the future would be seriously compromised. So the question is, should she pursue this career in nursing? Okay, that's just the example I'll stick with today, but you can think of lots of interesting cases of moral risk like this, where someone really genuinely wants to achieve a good but sees it as risky. So the other one that I'm interested in, and maybe we can talk about it in Q&A, is the case of, say, joining the military. So supposing you're not a pacifist. I myself am not a pacifist. I believe there is such thing as a just war. Here's the second thing I believe. Let's not get fixated, but I'll just say I believe that many wars that are prosecuted, say, by even our country, and most wars prosecuted in the 21st century of a kind of Anscomian view of these things are in fact not just wars, right? And I think that military culture inculcates certain dispositions that might make it hard to, say, realize that. But they're genuine goods to be achieved, but you might worry about what kind of person you'd become and whether you could achieve those goods, so is it worth the risk? Okay. So here's the situation we're in. Our nurse believes on reasonable grounds that she could do genuine good by embarking on a particular course of action, but she fears on no less reasonable grounds that the course of action might corrupt her character. The question I'm interested in is this: supposing that an active life of virtue is the greatest of goods, is it ever permissible to take the moral risk involved, and if so, when? Okay, so Tom Herka, after he gives this example, argues pretty briefly two things. One, that we should take some moral risks, but also that virtue ethicists, or anyone who claims that virtue is the greatest of goods, which he thinks virtue ethicists do, can't give a plausible account of when and how this could be so. If virtue is the greatest of goods, Herke says, then it seems impermissible to risk it in pursuit of some lesser goods such as health, right, or well-being for other people. But Nora, our aspiring nurse, can do much good in the world, so refusing to do it out of a fear she might become slightly less compassionate seems to reflect a myopic obsession with her own character. Indeed, it might seem to involve a kind of practical contradiction. If her own compassion is more valuable than someone else's health, then she should not risk the former to promote the latter. But isn't the point of being compassionate that we care about other people and not ourselves? Right? So the underlying problem, in his view, is this. By claiming that virtue is the greatest of goods, the virtue theorist seems to be directing the attention back to our own states of character, but surely the point of being virtuous is to promote values other than one's own virtue, right? We shouldn't help others because it makes us feel good or even turns us into compassionate people. We should help them because they need to be helped. Okay, so the needs of others are of more value. So Herke concludes, and in a really interesting, well-argued book, that virtue is always of lesser value than the goods towards which it's directed. Okay, so in what follows, I'm going to argue that this is wrong. This is a mistake. Taking moral risks is not only compatible with the claim that an active life of virtue is the greatest of goods, but also, even given that claim, taking such risks is sometimes required. Okay. So, on to the next section. Okay, so the first sort of step in the argument that I want to talk about is this, that we need to kind of get clear exactly what it means to say virtue is the greatest of goods, right? I mean, that could mean a lot of things, right? And the way Herke interprets it seems to be something like this: virtuous states of affairs are the greatest goods, or virtuous states of character are the greatest goods, and therefore they ought to be promoted, right? Or therefore they ought to be maximized. Okay, so I think that's not quite right, or it can't be quite what classical theories of virtue mean when they say virtue is the greatest of goods. First of all, Aristotle is very clear on this. It's not virtue itself, it's the active exercise of virtue. That's the highest good that promotes happiness, right? So that's a little bit different. It's not equivalent, right? So to say, in my mind, that virtue is the highest good for a classical virtue theorist is to say something like this, that one's life goes better and is more excellent just insofar as one acts in accordance with the virtues. Okay? So what exactly this means is determined in turn. We could talk about that actually for a long time in the longer version. There's different senses of teleological going on here. So in Q&A, if people are interested, we can talk about that, but I'll skip ahead for now. What exactly this means is determined in turn by what particular virtues and goods are relevant to the situation that one faces. If more than one virtue is relevant, and if their demands can conflict, we could also talk about that in Q&A. I'm going to assume they can. If you're a McDowell fan, there's a way to just fix that argument for that, but we'll talk about it later. There will not be an all things considered ought in regards to the demands of each particular virtue. What one ought to do, all things considered, will instead have to somehow balance the demands of the different virtues. But even so, you have to start somewhere, right? So let's start by asking what particular goods and virtues are relevant. In a situation of moral risk, the goods at stake are one's own virtue and the general well-being of others. So most obviously, the relevant virtue seems to be something like beneficence or sympathy. The agent considers taking a moral risk not for any trivial reason, not interested in that, right? Okay, but because it will or may genuinely promote the good of others in significant ways. Since the good of others seems to be what beneficence aims at, it seems that the demands of beneficence are what concern us here. Moreover, the proper mode of moral response for the virtue of beneficence seems to be one of promotion. Okay, we don't aim, in other words, when you're trying to be charitable, you don't aim, or beneficent, first and foremost at doing the beneficent thing, though you do, but you aim at actually securing the good for others. In this way, it's different than justice, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay. But at this point, I take it, the problem is thought to arise for the virtue ethicist sort of all over again, even if you didn't think you had this problem in the beginning of just promoting states of affairs versus acting virtuously. Okay, so the virtue of sympathy or beneficence, it seems, must respond to actual values in the world. Right? To act in accord with that virtue is to aim to promote genuine goods for the relevant agents in the situation. And if acting virtuously is the greatest of goods, it seems that promoting states of affairs where more of those actions come about is the most beneficent thing one can do. Okay, and so if an agent faces a situation in which she can promote the non-moral good of others at the risk of bringing about less virtue, then it seems she should not be allowed to promote the former at the expense of the latter. Okay, but would this advice follow if an active life of virtue is the greatest of goods? It's not obvious that it would. The virtue of beneficence is traditionally understood as the virtue directed at promoting the good of others. It's not a general virtue directed at promoting the amount of goodness in the world. In particular, it is not directed at promoting one's own good. So even if one's own active life of virtue were more valuable than the non-moral good of others, it would not follow that the virtue of beneficence directed one to promote it in preference to the non-moral good of others. Rather, it seems that we have a case of prima facie conflict between two different virtues. The virtues of beneficence, which is essentially other-directed, and the virtue, whatever it is, say, which is concerned with promoting our own moral development. But what virtue is that? Okay, it's not clear that the ancient philosophers believed such a virtue existed. When discussing moral development, Aristotle at least focuses virtually all of his attention on the education of the young. Indeed, he suggests that at times that a good upbringing with the proper habituation is pivotal if one is to develop into a virtuous adult. But this Aristotelian emphasis on habituation is not incompatible with the belief that an adult can change or improve her character. What it does imply is that such change will be neither easy nor instantaneous. It will instead require a period of rehabituation. And this seems exactly right. It seems virtually impossible to decide right this minute to be more caring, courageous, or just. But over time, we think people can set out on courses of action that make them more caring, courageous, or just, or alas, more callous, cowardly, or unjust. And insofar as none of us is completely virtuous, people have at least a prima facie obligation or something like that to set out on courses of actions that would make them more caring, courageous, or just, and not on the ones that would make them callous, cowardly, or unjust. So the disposition to do this well or virtuously does seem to be something worth calling a virtue. Okay. Christine Swatton has recently discussed such a virtue. In her words, there is paradoxically a virtue associated with self-improvement. Thank you. Following Martha Nussbaum, she distinguishes between the thin and thick conception of a virtue. The thin conception simply states the field or sphere of concern of the virtue and understands the virtue as being well disposed towards that field. The thick account of a virtue is an account of what it is to be well disposed. So perfectionism is the name she gives to the virtue under consideration. So on the thin account, perfectionism is simply whatever virtue constitutes being well disposed to striving towards excellence. This leaves open what the thick account of their virtue will be. Rival accounts of perfectionism as a virtue will differ on what it takes to be well disposed. One natural reading, an appropriate thick account of perfectionism seems to tell us simply to imitate the actions of the perfectly virtuous. Okay, you want to get better? Find the perfectly virtuous person and imitate them. Okay, but as she argues, this account is less attractive than immediate appearances indicate. For someone who's not yet fully virtuous, acting as the virtuous person acts with all the requisite motivations and effective responses might well be impossible. Given this, simply imitating their actions, doing what they do, but not as they would do it, might well result in certain kinds of motivational distortions and bad consequences. So she is really interested in the motivational distortions, and so she draws on the work of psychologist Karen Horney. I hesitate to talk about it in a room full of psychologists, so I'll blame it all on Swatton if you don't like this part. But she argues that seemed convincing to me as a non-psychologist, that such a perfectionism can be a vice if it's a mark of what she calls the expansionist type. So such a person identifies himself with his high standards and on this basis looks down on others. And such contempt for others is really an externalization of self-condemnation on the part of the individual. Okay, and one who acts in such a way doesn't act virtuously, even if his external actions seem to conform to the standards of the perfectly virtuous. Okay, because virtue isn't just about getting people to do the right things, right? Okay. But this is what I'm interested in. In addition to the motivational problems, I think that simply imitating the actions of the perfectly virtuous could lead to really bad outcomes, right? So what I'm calling a situation of moral risk are perfect examples of this claim. Okay, so take Nora again. Suppose the virtue of perfectionism were simply the disposition to imitate the actions of the perfectly virtuous. Okay, in that case, it would seem that, yeah, just become a nurse, right? I mean, she already believes that she can do much good by becoming a nurse. Her worry is that she might become less compassionate. But the perfectly virtuous person would have no such worry. Presumably, someone perfect in virtue would have the right dispositions to encounter ordinary human suffering without becoming less compassionate. Dealing with such things is, after all, part of what virtue is supposed to equip us to do. So if the virtue of perfectionism, told her to simply imitate the actions of the perfectly virtuous, it would seem that she ought to just sort of become a nurse and simply cross her fingers and hope not to become less compassionate. Okay, but none of this seems right to me, right? Okay, here's one problem. The justification for undertaking the effort in a case of moral risk appeals to the good one can do. But how much good one can do depends, at least in part, on what kind of person one becomes in the process. If you become totally lacking in compassion, you might lose some of your virtue, but just insofar as you do, you might also do less good for your patients. Right? So an appeal to the latter is at least a weaker justification for the former than it would have been had she not become less compassionate. Okay? And ignoring this is just to sort of be willfully blind, and that's not a virtue. Maybe gets you through the day, but that's different. So it seems right to say that the virtue of perfectionism, this is a quote now from Swanton, should be seen as a dynamic virtue that is to some extent relative to the imperfections of the agent. Okay, so what should the virtue of perfectionism tell us about when to take moral risks? Okay, so in asking this question, just to be clear, I'm not yet asking what we should do overall, right? Because again, I said the virtues might conflict, so I'm just talking about perfectionism right now. Next section, we'll talk about conflicts. So here's a couple of different cases, right? It could be that embarking on some course of action would result in one becoming, say, less, for example, compassionate, and there's just a 100% chance of that happening, right? I guess this is a limit case of a risk. You just know that you're going to do X, and X is itself not morally problematic, but it's going to set you on this course of action that's going to corrupt your character in some bad way. And that seems relatively straightforward, okay? Even if the immediate action is not in any sense wrong, the virtue is concerned not only with the immediate action of perfectionism, the virtue, okay, but with the relation in which it stands to one's own striving for excellence. If embarking on a course of action is guaranteed to make one worse, then it can hardly be thought to be in accord with the demands of a virtue directed towards making one better. Okay, so the interesting cases, of course, are like the ones I started with in this paper. The agent rightly fears for a virtue, but there's no guarantee that she will become less virtuous. Okay, it might seem as if taking such risks too would be incompatible with the virtue of perfectionism. How can it be virtuous to embark on a course of action that we know might make us less virtuous, or worse yet, might make us vicious? But on reflection, that can't be right either. It may often be the case that the same course of action might present some risk of making us less virtue, but also some opportunity of making us more virtuous, right? Okay, so you decide to be a nurse, a trauma surgeon, whatever. If you're worried about the gender, I didn't pick nurse, so I should switch it to trauma surgeon. Might rightfully fear that you would become less compassionate, but you might also rightfully hope that you'd become more compassionate by virtue of your experience, sort of wiser over time, right? But this is the crucial point for me, that could be true of one and the same person in one and the same situation. Indeed, for most of us, either one of these outcomes might seem quite possible. And which is more likely to occur might be almost impossible to predict. For one thing, there's simply a limit to the depth of our self-knowledge. Okay, and there's another reason why we should not understand the virtue of perfectionism as telling us never to take moral risk. Second reason. Namely, moral risk is simply pervasive. Step out your front door, take a moral risk. It'll be good for you. Right? For persons still imperfect in virtue, no course of action carries absolutely no risk of coarsening their character. Even very admirable actions of self-sacrifice okay, run the risk of puffing us up with pride and moral smugness. Especially admirable acts might indeed put you at peculiar or particular risk of this moral failing. But it doesn't follow that in the quest to become better people, we should never perform great acts of moral sacrifice. So the mere risk of a course in character cannot be a reason to think an action incompatible with the demands of perfectionism. If it were, you'd just be sort of paralyzed. Okay. But of course, not just any moral risk seems justified either. Okay, I mean, if the risk is real enough, but the possibility of improvement seems negligible or non-existent, the better part of wisdom is not to take such risks, especially if somebody else can do whatever good needs to be achieved for other people. Okay, so it seems like you want to aim for some sort of balance. Can you tell me how much time I have? Oh, sorry. Of course, 3 minutes?
Well, you started late.
Okay. I'm going to talk longer than 3 minutes. Sorry, but I'll try and be moderate. I will. None of us gives an easy answer to the question I sketched above. Okay, skip. On my account, look, okay, whether to take the risk depends upon very particular facts about the situation, the person in question. Right, and then I give some examples. If you want them in the Q&A, ask for them. But from a virtue theoretic perspective, the indeterminacy is no way worrying, right? It's part of the canonical understanding of that approach. The right or mean in action and feeling is relative to the individual. Okay, nobody ought to take inappropriate risks, but what constitutes an inappropriate risk for one person may not constitute an inappropriate risk for another. Okay, there's simply no answer to the question of whether a particular action would constitute the right amount of moral risk, independently of knowing who's performing what action in what particular situation. Okay, but that's just true in general, right? There's just no answer to the question of whether a particular action is brave rather than foolish, temperate rather than ascetical, right, without knowing exactly who's doing it in what situation. Okay, thus far, I've argued that there are two virtues whose demands are relevant in a situation of moral risk: beneficence, perfectionism. Beneficence, I suggested, seems mostly to direct one to take risks, but not always, right? If the risk is so high that you'll become bad, and in becoming bad you won't be able to do the good, then maybe even beneficence tells you not to do it. But mostly, let's say it does. Okay, but while perfectionism might direct one to take some moral risks, there are nonetheless some situations when it seems to direct one to hesitate. Okay, so maybe Nora's in a situation like this, I don't know. Maybe she's just highly unlikely to become anything but less virtuous in becoming a nurse. Okay, even so, she's highly likely to do a lot of good for others. Why? Because even if it's a little less good than if she were a nice nurse, geez, like if you're really in the, trauma surgery, even if your nurse is mean, if she sews everything up and you're not dead, that's good enough, right? I mean, so, would it be better if she was nice too, I suppose, right? But you could still do a lot of good even if you were kind of, as long as you're not Nurse Ratchet, even if you, as long as you're sort of just nurse kind of not friendly, that's okay, right? All right, so you could still do a lot of good. So in that case, right, is she permitted to take the risk? Okay, we're pretty sure she's going to be less compassionate, but she's still going to do a lot of good. Okay, it might seem like the question's easily answered. Both beneficence and perfectionism seem directed at promoting various kinds of goods. So it might seem like if there's sort of a conflict, just figure out which is going to promote the most good, right? And then go with that one. Okay, I think I can do this quicker without reading. So, but I think that that's just too simple if understood in one way, right? It just can't be the case that all of the conflicts between virtues are determined by figuring out which promotes the most good. I mean, if that were true, we might as well all just pack it in and be a consequentialist, right? For the following, I'm not saying if you're a consequentialist, it's fine. But if you're a virtue ethicist, you might not want to do that, right? Right, let's think about justice, right? If you said, well, look, we might have a conflict between beneficence and justice. Let's figure out which promotes the most good. Well, the conflicts only come up when beneficence seems to promote the most good, right? So think about the famous Anscombe case. Can you execute the innocent person to stop the riot, right? And she says, no, justice says, No, and if you just said, well, look, but it would do more good, so I guess since we have a conflict, then you'd always execute the innocent person. So what would be the point of having the virtue of justice? So that can't be the story on a virtue ethical account, is my view. But you might think this is a special case. Second point, last point on the handout, I think. You might think this is a special case because neither beneficence nor perfectionism, as I've talked about them today anyway, have to do with these like agent-centered constraints that justice does. They both are seeming to be, sort of the profile of promoting goods. So you might think in that special case, we should just decide which promotes the most good. So this is the last move in the argument, and now really 3 minutes. Okay, so I'll do it without the paper, so I hope it's pretty clear. The last move of the argument is just this. This is to just go back to the point I started with, really, to remind us that the highest good isn't just virtuous states, it's an active life of virtue. And an active life of virtue requires virtue, but also non-moral goods, right? And so that's the highest good, say. So even if you thought we should just do whatever's going to promote the highest good, right, it doesn't follow that you should always just promote your own virtue, because the active life of virtue requires both virtue and non-moral goods. And then here's the second part of this argument that's important, is this, that in promoting the highest good for, say, myself, it seems like for the most part, as long as I have a minimum amount of external goods, that what I really need to work on is my virtue, so to speak, right? Most of us have enough external goods to live an active life of virtue. But when I think about promoting the active life of virtue of other people, it's not so clear that would be the case, right? I mean, for one thing, it's just, generally speaking, and the psychologists can perhaps question me on this, but analytic philosopher armchair verdict says that it's really hard to promote other people's virtue directly. And here it's really important to emphasize that when I talk about virtue, I don't mean just getting people to do the right thing, right? That's not virtue. It's doing the right thing for the right reason. So think about trying to promote other people loving the good, or something like that. That's a lot harder, and it can often be counterproductive and all this stuff, right? So it might be that the best way to help other people live active lives of virtue or virtuous life is to promote the conditions of that, right? And that's often non-moral goods, right? Their health, their well-being. Aristotle thinks a certain amount of education, a certain amount of leisure, all of those things are required for a life of virtue, right? So even if we just wanted to promote the active life of virtue, so to speak, then it wouldn't follow that we should always prefer promoting our own virtuous states. So 1 minute, okay. I think I made it under the wire, and I'll stop there and take questions and hopefully clarify anything that went past. Thanks.
What I'm going to do to try to make this manageable is just call out a number. If you can remember your number and the person who comes just before.
What?
1, 2, 3, 4,
okay.
5, 6, 7, 8. Any questions? So Nancy, you're always number one.
Number one.
You are number one, Nancy.
Great paper.
Thank you. Thanks.
I have 3 quick points.
Oh, no.
Yes. One is I don't think the Nora case is a case of genuine moral risk.
Ooh,
We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
Number 2 is the way the case is described. Nora is aware of the moral risk, but if moral risk is pervasive, there's going to be much of which we are unaware.
Good.
How do we deal with that? So that's number 2. And number 3 is I agree with you that virtue is an active life, but for Aristotle, virtue is the stable and controlling element. So it would seem that even within that life, we would be enjoined to work for our virtue at the expense of non-moral goods, especially if we are supposed to be promoting the non-moral goods such as health as others. So there you go.
Yeah. 3. Wait, did you say those were quick points? Okay. So quick for you. So the first question we can talk about later, because you didn't elaborate why you think that. The second question, sorry, remind me now. I might.
Awareness.
Oh yeah, good. That is such a great question, and I agree with you that a lot of times we are completely unaware of what's going on. So what I need to think about that more, how to incorporate it in exactly here. But what I'm inclined to say, first of all, is that I do think there is an Aristotelian virtue of, well, Aristotle calls it truthfulness, but it really looks to me like something closer to self-knowledge, because the truths concerned are about you, right? They're not like truth in general. Aristotle's not actually talking about whether you can lie or whatever, because the vices are like boastfulness. And so I think that's got to come in, is the answer to that question. Now, how you get that self-knowledge, that might be a question that is very difficult to answer from the philosophical armchair. Yeah. Well, right. I mean, no, I think that's actually right. So, I mean, I think there are real limits to introspection, say, to just introspecting, like, is this going to work out well? Like, this is what my character's like.
They're not even aware. I mean, go to the app where there is no risk.
Yep.
They're not even aware that
Yep.
there's a risk involved. So
Right.
that's very problematic.
It's very problematic, yeah, and I think that's a bad thing to do. It could be that this is one of the cases where the virtues, I do think, I don't hold a strong unity of the virtues theory, but I do think there are clearly some real relations. So in this case, yeah, I mean, can you really have a sort of virtuous perfectionism if you've just got hardly any self-knowledge? Probably not, yeah. So that's what I'd say about that. Then the last question, can you remind me?
What we might,
Oh,
we
okay.
can just move on and
Oh,
just
all right.
when it comes to come back to it.
Okay. I don't remember who number 2 was, sorry.
What's number 2?
I think 2, 3.
Okay, so I'm wondering what you say about someone who is thinking about this notion of more risk and then thinks like the following.
Okay.
They say something like, well, you know, virtue ethicists tell me I gotta be compassionate,
Yeah.
but you know, compassion's hard, and virtue in general is hard,
Yeah.
and I can't do that, and you know, this sort of failure leads to more failure because my resolve is eroded, my self-esteem goes
Right.
down, and I get very resentful of virtue, I think, because I can't do any of this stuff. And so I just don't.
Wow,
You know,
yeah.
I just from like the bottom. I never get going upward, right?
Yeah. What would I say to them?
Yeah, like what? I guess there's a sort of a worry, maybe just a
Okay,
question
what's
of
the
like,
worry? Yeah.
does it just like go all the way down? Like Nora has had the case, but
Yeah.
you know, why you
I
walk
see.
outside the door because I can't do anything, and they're gonna be.
No, I'm saying don't be like that. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So I wasn't sure what you're. So is the worry? There could be a couple of things going on. So is the worry something like this, that the way I've talked about perfectionism as a dynamic virtue, it could be kind of an excuse for the morally lazy, right? Because I've said, look, Nietzsche says something like this, don't try and be more virtuous than you have the strength for. And so I think there's actually something in that. But so I take it your worry is, look, isn't that just an excuse to sort of do nothing? Is that the word?
Like virtue was hard, right? It's supposed to be the thing.
It is hard.
When you start recognizing that and taking that as like an excuse, then yeah, it might.
Yeah, okay, good. So that would be bad.
Yeah.
Okay, but all I'm saying is that there can be, so I'm agreeing that's bad, but what I'm saying is it can be bad the other way too. So here's an old example on a different topic from Bernard Williams. If people remember the tennis case, this is, okay, so Bernard Williams is this example, I forget if he was referring to him, as self-effacing or if, it was effacing of some other person. But I don't remember. But so anyway, there's a guy, say, who's a bad loser. We don't know any super competitive people like that in philosophy, but say we did. And they're just not a very good loser. And so when they lose a tennis game, the thought that goes through their mind is, I want to just whack this racket right over that guy's head. And they're like consumed by this thought. Okay, totally vicious, right? Okay, here's the polite thing to do at the end of a tennis game, I'm told, is you shake the person's hand over the net. And Bernard Williams says, like, for that guy, it would be a bad idea to be like, I'll go shake his hand. Because he's just sort of like deceiving himself that's going to happen, and he'll probably lose it, right? So what he should do is walk off the court. Is walking off the court ideal? Is it super virtuous? No. Is it rude? Yes, yada, yada, yada. Is it a lot better than whacking the guy over the head with a tennis racket? For sure. So, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. Like, so that just so here's the situation, right? Is it good that you're that guy? No. Okay, but now you are that guy. And we're all that guy about something, right? And like, what are you gonna do now, kind of thing, right? So I don't think it has to be an excuse for moral laziness. Could it be? Yes. Could a lot of things be excuses for a lot of bad behavior? All moral philosophy, yeah.
Number 3 was back there.
So I'm wondering about
Yeah.
how Lisa Tessman's burden virtues fit into this story.
You'll have to tell me more about Lisa Tessman's burden virtues for me to know.
So take the case of the individual who's living in an unjust society, who is committed to creating a more just society.
Okay,
In part
good.
because they recognize that the conditions that would enable others to develop their own virtues
Yes.
may need to be realized
Yep.
by creating a situation that gets rid of certain systemic evils
Yep.
and the like. It looks as though in the case of this revolutionary, as
Yes.
the story unfolds, it will be good for them to pursue this course in a way that's going to silence their attentiveness to certain other constraints because of the way in which the revolution will need to unfold in order to achieve this end. We think
Like they're going to
that-
ignore their family or something? Is
Yeah,
that- okay.
so there are other goods that may have to be sacrificed in the sake of the cause and the like. This individual looks as though they manifest traits of character that in that context we would approve, even if in this context we don't want them as our next door neighbor or as our father or what have you. And so here's a trait that looks as though it's A, something we want to endorse as a desirable trait of character that we admire in them. B, is in fact oriented to creating
A good,
this set
yeah.
of goods, but C is going to preclude their enjoying a kind of perfectionist version of a life of virtue.
They're not going to be as good as they could be.
Right.
Yeah, good. So that's a great question, right? So a couple of things. First of all, just a general comment. So the written end of the paper, which is, I think, a little more elegant than the way I had to end here over time. But I talked about the fact that this is just a case. I think of what you might call our need for non-ideal virtue theory or something, right? That we live in a very imperfect world. You and I have very imperfect characters. I mean, I have a threshold view of virtue. I don't think you have to be perfectly virtuous to be virtuous, full stop. So I think you can be generous without being perfectly generous. And people, so I don't have that kind of a idealistic view. But I think even once you say that, we live in a very imperfect world. And so this person... okay, a couple of things, I guess. I guess it depends exactly how the case gets spelled out. So I said, well, like she's going to ignore her family or something. Well, I mean, I worry about like certain people who want to live super radical lives or something. Like I worry that maybe they should make certain choices, somewhere before they got to this point where now it's like, they're going to abandon their kids or something like that. I mean, I made an acquaintance, maybe this is kind of what you're getting at, I don't know. An acquaintance the other week who is, he's a felon. He's a felon, but he's a felon because he broke into a nuclear site in upstate New York a week after he got married. He and his wife did. They broke into a site in New York and banged on a missile, right? And they both did about a year in a federal penitentiary in upstate New York about 18 years ago or something like that, right? And then they had a bunch of kids. And after they had a bunch of kids, they made a decision to only one of them would commit felonious acts of protest at a time, right? This actually strikes me as really like pragmatic and probably the right thing to do, right? So I would say in that case, this is what I'm saying, it all depends on the case. Like to me, if somebody said, well, look, I do more good by protesting, nuclear, this, that, and the other, but I'm a single parent and I have 4 kids, that doesn't sound so good to me. That doesn't sound so virtuous, right? Because I don't believe in just promoting the most good, like in some strict sense. This is why I said promoting goods for relevant agents, and I didn't say maximizing the good for the universal world. That was very careful, actually, because I do believe we have, special obligations to those near and dear to us. So that's one thing I'm a little bit worried about with this question where you said, we want to go change the world. You have to be careful about your special obligations. But I think it's a really important issue. I don't know if I exactly got at your worry. I'm feeling like maybe not from the look on your face. But we could talk later, or you can follow up, or okay.
Number 4.
Hi, Becky.
Hi, Terrence.
Clarificatory question about
Oh, good.
the pieces about virtue is the greatest good.
Yes.
So you distance yourself from the sort of the quasi-consequentialist understanding,
Yep.
which I think is right, and then you say we should understand along the following lines: one's life goes better and is more excellent.
Yes.
Now, do you mean by one's life goes better, do you mean that one's life is well lived? Because it seems to me there is a distinction between one's life going well and living one's life well. And I'm trying to determine which one you mean, because if you do mean that your life actually goes better, that seems to be a very controversial thesis.
I see what you're saying.
Whereas if you say you're living a well-lived life, that seems like the sort of thing a virtue theorist ought to say.
Yeah, I see. So you're worried. So tell me if this is if I've got the worry right. So is the worry that the first one is sounding like something quasi-stoic, like if you're virtuous, then that guarantees that you're also happy and your life went, okay, good. Yeah, I'm not a quasi-stoic. So yeah, I don't think virtue, I think you can live your life well, but then there's another sense in which it might not go well because you end up on the rack. Yeah, so in that case, I think I'm wanting to go with the second interpretation. So perhaps that makes it sound a bit redundant, and I was perhaps just trying to clarify. But I can see why that opens it up for thinking, oh, that must mean something else. So I should fix that in the written version, so thanks.
Hi, so here's a reason to wonder whether Nora's in a situation of moral risk.
Oh, okay, back to the
All right,
okay.
if we assume that she is virtuous,
Yes.
has the virtue of compassion,
Mm-hmm.
all right, and she's worried because of what happens with so many who enter the profession.
Yeah,
And they do so for good reasons.
I think, yeah.
Okay, now, you define virtue, or maybe you weren't defining it, but one thing you said about it was that it's doing the right thing for the right reasons.
Yeah, I didn't mean that to be, I believe
not
that
all
it's
of
not,
it.
yeah, okay.
Okay, so now if these other, say, most nurses are
Okay.
doing this for the right reasons,
Yes.
that wouldn't be tantamount to having a virtue, perhaps.
No.
Now if, okay, no, yeah. Okay, so. if-
Yes, I'm agreeing with you that no, it wouldn't be
All
tantamount
right,
to having
so
the
suppose
virtue.
they don't.
Yeah.
Suppose they don't have the virtue.
Yeah.
But they're
Oh,
doing
I
this
see
for
where
the
you're
right
going.
reasons.
Yes.
But she does have the virtue.
Yes.
All right, so now she
Okay,
doesn't
good.
have such a good reason
To worry
to
that
back
she was,
off,
I see.
And that might not be moral risk in her case.
Good, that's great. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, good. So first thing, right, that wasn't supposed to be a necessary and sufficient condition, doing the right thing for the right reasons. I was just wanting to emphasize, because some of the psychology talks just to me seemed, because of the nature of it, to emphasize behavior rather than intentional states. So I was just trying to emphasize I really care about intentional states too. But yeah, to have a virtue, you have to have a well-settled disposition and all that other stuff too, not just the right reasons, because the continent person has the right reasons, sort of. Let's say he does. I mean, okay, it's a little controversial, but he has something close to the right reasons. Okay, so now the question is, okay, so I say, well, I guess I didn't stipulate whether she was compassionate, but we're going to stipulate. Did I? Did I say she was
I just thought
compassionate?
it was implied.
Okay, all right. So let's say I
Because
agree.
the context is,
Yeah.
I mean, the supposition.
She's
is
worried about becoming less
that
compassionate.
you can be at moral risk as a virtuous person.
Yes. Okay, so I think that this is related to a point I made earlier, which is that I do believe that virtue is a threshold concept. So I believe that you can be compassionate without being perfectly compassionate. And so it can be true that Nora's compassionate but not perfectly compassionate, in which case she could become less compassionate, right? But so that's I think part of the answer. But the second point you make, I think, escapes that part of the answer, which is a kind of evidential point in a way. I thought you were trying to say, look, but the other people, she might think like they're kind of continent in a way, so that's why they've gone wrong, right? But if she's more confident in her virtue, then she shouldn't be worried because they're not good evidence, because they're not like her. Yeah, that could be true. So that's a case that I believe could exist. But I think there could also be a genuine case where she meets the threshold for being compassionate, but she's not perfectly compassionate. I do want to emphasize in this part of the project that our characters really do change and develop over time. So there's a stability, but not like a rigidity, right? And so I think that you could have a legitimate worry about that. I don't think that all people who, depending also on how extreme the situation is, and maybe you think that the nursing case isn't quite this extreme, but some like trauma surgeries can be quite extreme experiences for people. And the more extreme the experience, the more chance it could really shake even a somewhat stable character, I think. I mean, I think war does actually terrible things to people. Even just wars, I think, do terrible things to, I mean, if you look at, you know, the kind of things that are happening to our soldiers who are coming back.
We're going to have to
Oh,
wrap it up to give
sorry.
people a chance to stretch their legs and whatnot, but there will be time to ask more questions in the hallway. Thank you, Rebecca.